And here we finally go. War of 1812 PowerPoint notes. Some of the major events that basically led up to the War of 1812. War of 1812 is always a war that kids have heard of simply because it's named after a year. But what students are always unsure of is what's the deal with it. This is going to be a war between the United States and a very familiar foe for us, some country that we've actually battled before and not long ago in the American Revolution, which is going to be the British. The United States shipping was being harassed. You remember last unit when we talked about Jay's Treaty and also when we talked about the XYZ affair, that basically Great Britain and France were basically picking on our shipping, and they were kind of being harassed. Our cargo, which means the supplies on the ships, that was being stolen and taken into other people's hands, so the United States wasn't getting money for the shipping of their goods. And also some of the sailors were being impressed, which doesn't mean that they were impressed with what the British were doing. Instead, it basically means they were being taken prisoner. What Great Britain did is they required licenses for ships that were bound for Europe. A lot of British sailors became naturalized United States citizens, and they deserted British vessels, so they deserted their British ships and joined the American crews. Now, the British became very upset about this, and because of that, the British Navy started to kidnap some of these sailors off American ships and basically forced them to rejoin the British Navy. Over 250 American ships were seized. Now, when you think about American trading in the very early 1800s, 250 cargo ships being stolen, being basically kidnapped by the British, is really going to have a detrimental, which means it's going to have a really bad impact on American trading. And it means that we're not going to be able to make nearly as much money for our economy if all these ships just keep getting stolen. A lot of you will like this little political cartoon here. You can kind of see how the cargo is being seized, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. Economic diplomacy fails. The Embargo Act of 1807. This was an act put through by the United States government. And basically what the Embargo Act did is it basically stopped all trade with all parts of Europe. So it wasn't just Great Britain and France. The Embargo Act just said that we're not going to trade with anyone over in Europe. An embargo, by the way, this is a great vocabulary term for you guys to know. An embargo is just simply a government ban on trade with other countries. For instance, in the United States today, we actually have a trade embargo with Cuba, which means that the United States and Cuba are not allowed to trade goods. One thing that Cuba is known for are their very famous Cuban cigars. And Cuban cigars are not legal in the United States. And it's actually funny if you ever drive over to Canada. Canada does not have an embargo with Cuba. So it's funny because you literally pull into Canada, across the river from Detroit, and you'll see all these shops for Cuban cigars. And the idea is, well, you can't have them in the United States, but you can have them in Canada. So it's rather interesting to see that dynamic. But again, an embargo is just a government ban on trade. The Embargo Act is going to be very, very unpopular in port cities, especially in the north. So that means it's very unpopular. It's not well liked in a lot of these big northern cities. I'll give you a second to think. Why do you suppose this embargo, this ban on trade, was going to be so unpopular in some of these big northern cities? Think about that for a second. The idea is that these really big cities relied on trade. They relied on a lot of the money from trade to basically boost their businesses and to boost their economy. And so if you're not allowed to trade with Europe, which was a big trade partner, Great Britain, France, and all the other countries over in Europe, that's really going to have a negative impact on the amount of money that they can make. Take a look at this statistic. Before the act, Americans exported, which means they sent out $108 million in goods. After the Embargo Act, there was only 22 million. So you're talking the vast majority of the money that they were making from exporting, trading their goods, the Embargo Act just killed the economy. Other reasons that maybe we want to go to war with Great Britain. One is the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. What this did is it basically forbade trade with just France and Great Britain. Again, the Embargo Act was banning trade with all of Britain, so not just France and Britain, but Spain or Switzerland or Italy or any other countries over in Europe But basically, this just forbids trade with France and Britain with the Non-Intercourse Act, so it's not quite as strict. However, the president could reopen trade when either France or Britain lifted the restrictions. Again, both France and Britain, we talked about this with Jay's Treaty, we talked about this with the XYZ affair, both were kind of harassing United States shipping. So the Non-Intercourse Act basically replaces the Embargo Act and allows the United States to trade with all nations except France and Britain. Warhawks. I just think this is an incredibly cool name. If it were up to me and I could make a mascot for some team, I would go with Warhawks. So I think this is a really cool term that's very easy to remember. A Warhawk is basically a Southern congressman who favored war against Great Britain, even though it hurt the East, or even though it hurt people in the Northeast, to be specific. Again, the South relied mostly on farming for their economy, and so they weren't quite as reliant on the trade goods. And so a lot of these Warhawks wanted to go to war with Britain, or they wanted to go to war with France because they simply hated what had been going on, in terms of the ships being harassed and all that stuff. And they said, well, let's go to war with them and let's teach them a lesson. Now, the North didn't exactly want to do that quite as badly because they were nervous that they wouldn't have any trading partners if they went and started a war. So these Warhawks wanted war because of the abduction, the impressment of these American sailors. They were very outraged by this and by the stealing of the goods as well. All this happens right toward the end of Thomas Jefferson's presidency, and basically also comes into its own as James Madison becomes president. This is James Madison right here. Thomas Jefferson follows the precedent set by George Washington, and he serves only 2 terms as a United States president. Of course, we've talked about his role in Louisiana Purchase and sending Lewis and Clark out to explore the West. But James Madison was actually Jefferson's Secretary of State, so he was a part of Madison here was a part of Jefferson's cabinet. He'd kind of helped lead the expansion out west as well, which we definitely heard about when we read the skit. And he was considered basically to be one of the most important figures in the United States because he's known as the father of the Constitution. James Madison writes the majority of the Constitution, and that's kind of one of the reasons he becomes our 4th president. He has a lot of experience. He basically writes the Constitution, and so he did eventually become president. Just a little fun fact for you: he's our shortest president ever at 5'4". If you're curious who our tallest president ever is, you're probably going to be right in your guess, because if your guess is Abraham Lincoln, that's true. Abraham Lincoln about 6'5", 6'6". James Madison only about 5'4". So I call him Shorty sometimes, Shorty Madison, because he just wasn't a very big human being, to say the least. Some of the benefits of going to war with Great Britain, and there were a lot of reasons that some people wanted to, and as we'll discuss in the next slide, there were also a lot of reasons why people didn't want to go to war with Great Britain. First reason you should write down is that we wanted to allow the reopening of trade. The idea was that if we could go to war with Great Britain, then what would happen is we could basically reopen the trade with them. So if we defeated them in war and we basically made them mind and made them not interfere with our shipping and interfere with our trading, then we would be able to retrade our goods and we'd be able to increase our economy. Another thing is this sense of national pride. Believe it or not, every time the United States goes to war, there is a huge influx in national pride. I think I've used the example in class before of after September 11th, 2001, even though it was such a terrible terrorist attack, the United States in some ways grew a lot closer because people really got this huge swell of pride. They really loved being part of their country, and so some people wanted to go to war, just to have a sense of pride in the United States and to bring people together. Again, the issue, like the Warhawks wanted, they wanted to get rid of this basically stealing of American ships and this abduction or this impressment, this kidnapping of American sailors, and so there are a lot of people that were upset about that. Last but not least, and this is going to sound crazy to some of you, although some of you would probably argue you would like this even today, Canada. At this point in time, Canada was controlled partially by the British. The United States literally figured, well, if we go take over Canada, then they'll want to join us in a fight against Great Britain. And as we'll talk about tomorrow, this plan isn't exactly a good one, but The United States really believed that if they could take over the nation of Canada, if they could invade Canada and force the British to basically have to fight for Canada, that would be a really good way to get what they wanted and to get these cargo ships to not be harassed and to not be having their goods stolen. But kind of an interesting concept there, to say the least. They want to go to war. And just one quick note for you. Some of you might be wondering, well, Mr. Bazem, what I don't understand, if France and Britain were both doing this to the United States, then why are we only wanting to go to war with Great Britain? A couple things to keep in mind. Obviously the British were basically one of our biggest rivals. We fought against them in the American Revolution, whereas the French, they basically helped us to win the American Revolution. And France was kind of going through their own revolution. We talked about with Napoleon, and so it was really more of a concentration on, well, let's fight the British. And I think that our relationships with the French will eventually be okay, which for the most part they were. But again, not everyone wanted to go to war. Some reasons for that. The military was very small. We talked about this in the American Revolution. It's not like the United States had the most powerful army in the world. And in 1812, when this war starts, the United States has really only been around with an established government for about 25 years. And so we don't have time to build up this awesome army. We don't have time to build up this awesome economy. Compared to France and Britain. In this case, we're talking about Britain because that's who we're going to fight this war against. But we don't have the superpower abilities that they have in terms of their army or in terms of their finances. And so, some people said, well, we just can't fight them again. We were very lucky to win the first time, but people said, we can't win a second time. Not with our tiny little army. Also, the militia was comprised most of our forces, and they did not like to fight outside of their state borders. This idea again of, well, if we're going to go to Canada and fight, if we're going to fight the British in all these different places, we wanted to fight on our home field. And it's not like our ships were being stolen from American seaports. Instead, they were being stolen, they were being violated, they were being harassed over in Europe. So this wasn't really happening within the borders of the United States. Also, our Navy, our armed forces on the ocean, we only had 22 ships. 22 naval ships for an entire country. So what are we going to do? Sail over to Great Britain with our 22 ships and try to fight them on their home turf? That wouldn't be a very smart move, as obviously we'd be easily destroyed. So there were a lot of positives we talked about the last slide, but there were a lot of negatives that really a lot of politicians and a lot of people in the United States said, no, let's not go to war. That'd be a really bad idea. Last but not least, Britain was a great superpower. And you guys would probably like this. A lot of you probably would agree. They could crush us like a bug. They could just boom. It would be very simple for the British to defeat us. There were a lot of people in the United States that said, we're really grateful we won the American Revolution. And we talked about this in class. If you looked at it on paper, we really shouldn't have. The British had so many more advantages than we did, and yet we were still able to come away with the victory in the American Revolution. So people didn't want to have to fight the British a second time. It was more of those, well, we got a lucky punch in, and we don't want to fight them again because that could really hurt us. We could lose too many men. And the big fear was, if we go to war now, we could lose a lot of what we gained. So maybe we'd lose some of the territory that we'd earned, or that we'd gained the Treaty of Paris, or maybe some of that land that was just newly acquired with Louisiana Purchase. Maybe we would lose that. And so those were all big things that people looked at and said, is this worth going to war about? What we're going to talk about in the next class is where we go from here in this war. Again, please make sure that you save these notes under War of 1812 and be sure you put them in your social studies folder because we will be taking it directly from this next slide when we start our next class. Thank you very much. Again, make sure that you're saving these.